Thank you, everybody, for coming. It's time for the Hacker Culture panel with Gabriella Coleman and Brewster Kale from the Internet Archive. And we're basically, it seemed like a good time to talk a little bit more about like what actually happened in terms of the hack that Aaron did. And it really was an elegant hack in terms of what he did, which was just writing a script to download the journal articles faster. And if it hit the limit for the account, then he would create a new account and then go back to downloading again. And so it really just seemed like a time saver, really. And we learned from Alex Stamos, who was hired to be an independent consultant for the defense in the case, that there was actually agreements between JSTOR and MIT and Harvard, and that, and since Aaron was a Harvard fellow at the time, an ethics fellow of all things, he wasn't even breaking the law in that way when he downloaded all these articles. So there was no crime and no nefarious hacking at all. And so when people do sort of more questionable hacks in Aaron's name, it can sometimes make our skin crawl a little bit and just want to clarify that kind of stuff. And so that's why I thought it would be a good time, since I had Gabriella here. And it also gives us a chance to be able to talk about really if there's were other hacking situations that we wanted to talk about, or if you guys wanted to sort of try to figure out the one thing that's kind of been bugging you about this thing. It's kind of like, that's what Gabriella is really good for. And she can help us figure out. So we'll be able to hop around a little bit if you guys have questions, and that's why I wanted to leave room for questions. So I had Brewster come up here because Brewster's a hacker, and he was a hacker at MIT. He was a hacker at MIT with a guy named Marvin Minsky. And it's really interesting how these people are heroes or villains, depending on who's around at the time, and the sort of the atmosphere at the time, I think, has a lot to do with it too, the political atmosphere. And so I wanted to ask Brewster to kind of start off with just talking about like when he was at MIT and how these kinds of hacks, like downloading something faster when it was taking too long anyway and that kind of thing, is really built into the culture at MIT. And it really wasn't anything different. It should have been sort of, you know, carrying on the traditions even, but even though it wasn't taken that way.
Yeah, what happened to Aaron is completely strange from the culture of MIT.
Thank you. Sorry.
Good enough? Listening? No? Not so good?
Can you hear him?
Okay, can you? We're not getting thumbs up in the back? All right, we're moving. Okay, late 70s, building and the artificial intelligence lab, hacking on Lisp machines. And at that point, we didn't sign code. Signing code was thought of as arrogant. So at the top of files, you didn't do that because it was a community project. You could tell who had written what code because people have different ways of writing code. But the idea, it was all for building the machine. It was a community project. And so this worked actually very, very well. And so the code could move back and forth, and we thought of ourselves as hackers and doing this job. I think what sort of went wrong in one of these circumstances was the 1976 Copyright Act, which declared everything copyrighted. Just like, you know, you spit on the ground and that's copyrighted life plus 50 and then extended. It's just, you know, it was stupid. And one of the first areas where the wheels came off the cart was in software and these community projects. So MIT, I think, in its wonderful wisdom said, well, if everything's owned, then the Lisp machine software is owned by us, and therefore we can fork it, and we can sell it to Symbolics. And Richard Stallman, almost single-handedly, but there were a bunch of us, that tried to keep the MIT fork up to date with sort of what this VC-funded thing was, and it almost killed Richard Stallman. And he's the most prodigious hacker I've ever gotten to work with. He could write flawless code at typing speed. It's just unbelievable. But he basically gave up, and he said, we're going to lose the Lisp machine because it was forked. That this wonderful operating system was going to be lost because it was forked, they were going to develop it, they were going to die, because all companies die, that's what they do, that's what they're for, is dying, but they die too late. But anyway, so they brought the Lisp machine down with them, and he said, okay, what we have as a problem here is this copyright stuff. So he basically said, okay, let's do this GNU public license, let's go back to some ridiculously awful operating system that we can go and work on, which would be Unix. And then basically started up that path. The culture, though, of MIT's hacking was go for it, do things, go play with stuff. I wanted to find out what the laws and how did people deal with courts of dealing with the Vietnam War. How do you get out of the Vietnam War draft? Well, MIT didn't have a legal library. Harvard did, but Harvard was locked. So, but I got my professor to give me his ID that didn't have a picture on it, and I broke into Harvard's law library to be able to learn how to deal with laws that were, but this sort of culture of doing that was actively encouraged. So Aaron's work, when he worked here on the Open Library project, but he did a bunch of things outside of the project. For instance, going and downloading the public domain books from the Google project and started uploading them to the Internet Archive, not as an employee, but as a pile of volunteers. Maybe some of you guys are here that helped with that, of going and in parallel, going and getting around their technological measures, their public domain books, and uploading them to the Internet Archive. And we just started seeing these flooding in. And we said, well, who's that? What's going on? And well, it's Aaron and his friends. And we said, great, let's go and get the metadata to be right. Let's go and give attribution to the libraries that it came from. Let's go and say thank you to Google and put links in back to them. And so we did this, and about 800,000 books came in, all working, all great. And everybody was happy about it, as best I could tell, except Google kept trying to up the technological measures to make it more difficult for this type of public domain accessibility to happen. Pacer, public domain materials. There was an opening to go and have all you could eat at the Boston Public Library. He set up a laptop to download a lot of it, and he did. This was actually a call by Carl Malamud, who I think will be here tonight, to go and do something like this. But this got him in trouble. And these are the sorts of hacks that were actively encouraged in sort of the hacker idea, and are not illegal. There's nothing that I've seen in working with Aaron and any of his projects where he had any inkling of going and making publicly accessible things that weren't public domain. So Internet Archive has lots of things that are not public domain that we make publicly accessible, but Aaron didn't do those. He was really very particular about the law and staying within it, but acting within a hacker community. So when MIT went and called the cops on somebody that was just writing a script to go and download to be able to do some data mining, this is really out of character. I tried to figure out who did that, and I called some of my friends that were still involved, and they said, not me, I didn't do that. And it started this whole grinding Kafkaesque world going forward of when you call the cops or the authorities on somebody, sometimes it's really out of your hands. I think that MIT could have played a much stronger role in trying to squash it. JSTOR certainly could have, but it was improper. So JSTOR, as best I could tell, went kind of nuts on MIT when it said, somebody's doing a lot of downloading. And they'd had issues in other universities going and downloading these things. Surprise, it's a really great data set. But they didn't want this to happen. They put pressure on MIT. MIT called the cops. That was really strange. MIT during my day did anything they could to keep the Cambridge cops off campus. anything they could. The year before I got there, there'd been a major bust of acid production in one of the dorms, Bexley, and this acid was going everywhere in the Northeast. It was really, really good acid, and they traced it back to this dorm, and they busted the kid that was making it and distributing it. And MIT made a deal to get the kid off completely as long as they cleaned up the campus. And so by the time I got there, they made a show about trying to keep the smoke-ins kind of under control and stuff like that. But they did everything they could to try to keep the cops off. So I don't know quite what the circumstances were that JSTOR got to MIT to act out of character, if MIT has changed character, and why didn't sort of really actively work to squash this. There's other things that I learned. I'm babbling on about this.
All right, keep
but
going.
there were some problems in this particular case, that the feds came down so hard on Aaron that they basically traced and wanted to basically intimidate anybody that he was associated with him. So they tried to make it so they didn't talk to anybody about this. And so I think he felt very isolated. There were a lot of people that all through Aaron's career helped him out. He was a wonderkin of our generation. And so there are a lot of people helping out, and he felt that he couldn't reach out, and I think it made him feel much more isolated. That's another real problem as part of the whole court system. Once there's this Kafkaesque thing starts to go with cases, it's a real problem. The key thing is stay out of court, and please don't jump to the conclusion that you should call the authorities on anybody else. It's a very heavy, blunt hammer that doesn't work very well, even in best of circumstances. And we get people crushed by them. And Aaron, of course, is one. So the MIT ethos was not followed through. What Aaron was doing by doing mechanical download is something that we actively encourage people to do on the Internet Archive. And people have APIs to make happen, and they actively do it. The idea that there was some hacker here that had to be crushed, I think was a Kafkaesque thing by some very overzealous prosecutors, and MIT and JSTOR did not come to his defense to go and try to say, this isn't the guy that you're thinking of. Go after somebody else. That didn't happen, and it ended very badly.
Gabriella, I see you jotting down all your notes.
Yeah, no, it was extremely interesting because you were there part of the sort of birth of this hacker ethos at MIT, and I'm much more of an outsider who is an anthropologist who kind of studies the different worlds of hacking. And I think what I want to do is just kind of complement some of the issues that you raised around Aaron Swartz and his persecution in lots of ways, because I think what you've put on the table is that on the one hand there's just so much clarity around the fact that what he had done was not illegal, right? And yet the response by MIT, JSTOR, the police became Kafkaesque and was very aggressive. And in some ways, I think it's always going to remain a little bit of a puzzle why you had that disjuncture. But I think that there's one interesting explanation that I'd like to explore just a little bit. So on the one hand, by the time Aaron Swartz was intervening in the world politically, technologically, the term hacker, of course, had taken on many meanings. At the time that you were at MIT, there was a kind of innocence around the term hacker. There weren't any sort of dark and bad associations. In the 80s and 90s, it kind of amassed those types of associations. But actually, I think in the 2000s, what was interesting was that on the one hand, you still had a lot of negative associations around hackers as kind of pure criminal activity. But because of the role of hacktivists, whistleblowers leaking, the role of the open source movement, there had kind of been a rehabilitation around the term. So there were many different associations. There wasn't always something negative. And so with someone like Aaron Swartz, what I find so interesting about him is that I think he was such a threat precisely because he was such a difficult figure to demonize. precisely because he wasn't doing anything illegal, precisely because he had the respect of so many people in different quarters of the technological world, from academia, from the hacker world, industry, right? He was a really respected figure. So in some respects, when he acted, when he published a statement about opening information, when he contributed to Creative Commons, people listened in a way that when you have something like Anonymous, which is another kind of domain I've worked on, they inherently are controversial the very moment they appear. And so it's quite easy in some ways to back them into a demonic corner, whereas with Aaron, that was very, very difficult thing to do. And this is why I think the Pacer incident is so interesting and fascinating in many ways, because precisely when Carl Malmud had sort of made the call to ask people to start downloading these documents from the 17 libraries where they were made available, this was perfectly legal to do. It was just very, very clever. And so Aaron, with the help of others, precisely started to download some of this material. It received tremendous publicity as well. And in many respects, I think that threats, that the threatening part was precisely doing something that could stay within the bounds of the law, publicize something that a lot of people believed in, which is court records should be publicly available for free or very, very, very low cost. And this is when I think the FBI became interested in him, precisely because he had the type of reputation and standing to change people's hearts and minds.
Yes, and I think it was rather serendipitous too. When he did the Pacer hack, the way the system was set up, it was roughly one library every 22,000 square miles or something, and he just happened to hear about it and then know somebody within the range of close enough to one of these libraries, and sort of went off in the corner where he was and did some work that day, and it all sort of came together in that serendipitous way. And in a way, he was being creative, like a hacker, with these very ridiculous confines that he was given for obtaining these public domain materials, and he just found a way to do it. And so the FBI got mad, we think. They were driving up and down the driveway by his parents' house and making their presence known. I always think about it. They kind of have to make they don't have to make their presence known when they're surveying people. They could do it in a way that they don't know about it. So for me, it's always that kind of little extra rub when they want the parents to know that they're watching, or that kind of thing. And that was definitely going on. That's covered in the Aaron Swartz movie. If you haven't seen it, The Internet's Own Boy.
Can you understand her?
Can you hear me? Okay, just making sure. You can't hear me?
Go.
Okay. So The Internet's Own Boy covers this really well, and I actually have that clip that I meant to put up by now, but I will be putting it up because it really covers the nuts and bolts of I like to call it the Pacer download experiment, and the nuts and bolts of how it works. And the thing that we're figuring out, because Carl had a theory about that there was a new legal person at MIT that sort of like, that's why they went right to the cops instead of handling it more internally and stuff like that. But that story didn't actually check out with the people that I talked to, who thought, no, there wasn't anything unusual like that at the time. It was just that they were waiting. It was like when they followed him that night and pushed him off his bike and beat him up, that was supposed to be a Secret Service operation. He was already in the crosshairs before this happened. That's the part that I think we have to kind of remember. So they were waiting for him to do something. And again, at face value, even we found out later that he hadn't actually done anything illegal because of these agreements that were made and things like that. I guess at face value, it looked like he had maybe finally crossed the line and downloaded some copyright stuff or something. Who knows what an overzealous agent might try to turn this into. But that's all just, hypothesizing from the things that I've been able to figure out about, and also from a few personal experiences where you feel like you have this big heavy thing that you don't want to talk to anyone about, and you just sort of reach out a little less about everything. You just don't want to, you maybe don't go to that family event or something. You know, you just really don't want to, you're worried about getting other people involved in whatever it is, because you kind of don't know what it is. It's just something weird and creepy and you don't know what it is. And so if this was going on with Aaron for 1 year, 2 years, I can start to understand how he could have gotten isolated and maybe gotten to, it's still hard for us to understand how he could have been that depressed, because everybody that knew him is in agreement that he really wasn't a depressed guy. He wasn't one of these hackers. He wasn't one of these sort of Mr. Robot hoodie guys that's pouting all the time and, you know, banging his head against the wall when nobody's looking. That wasn't Aaron. He wasn't like that. And people, somebody heard another story about somebody who saw him just the month before it happened, and he seemed in a very good place, seemed very happy. So it was definitely sort of like things closed in and got bad all at once, or again, we don't know what led up. But it was really bad timing, man, because his lawyers had just made a bunch of breakthroughs and some evidence they were trying to put together, and things were starting to look good. Alex Stamos was putting his expert testimony together, and he really thought they were going to go in there and talk about freedom and make the government look silly for this. That's what they thought they were going to do. They were just starting to think they were going to do, but I guess nobody had conveyed this to Aaron yet. Like, seriously, they were just about to call him with some information of some stuff that happened 2 days before when this happened. And so he didn't know that things were starting to look a little better yet, is the story that I heard. And so it was just really a horrible sequence of timing. Yeah. So I think we want to...
So I'd like to not leave with lead with a real message that open access is going to get you into the crosshairs and have a lot of problems. I think I'm not exactly sure why they tried to pick on Aaron. You know, these are good theories, but there are lots and lots of us that have been working in this area for a very, very long time. And the whole free software movement started by Richard Stallman, which is a brilliant hack on the legal system to build a bubble within an oppressive regime, which is the copyright regime, where you have voluntary admission into a bubble that works better, and it's changed how our whole field works. But at that time, in the 80s when that was coming out, Microsoft just, I'd love to get the real quotations, but it was more or less, capitalism is going to end. It's all over because of Richard Stallman's free software license. I mean, it was there's sort of this dramatic sort of, oh my God, you've got to stop this sort of thing. And, you know, obviously it's wrong. And Microsoft is now a major proponent of open source software and free software. So a lot of these changes meet with resistance. But going through things where you're kind of open about what you're trying to do and not just poking people in the eye actually works fairly well. Demonstrate that your service works better. And I think that's what Aaron did in general. He was quite visible about what he did, but I don't think of it as being obnoxious and how he did it. I think the Internet Archive basically is this kind of role of going and making permanent public access to materials. We're open and straightforward about what we're trying to do. We have open forums about what we're trying to do, and we just try to move through it and help people realize that this technology isn't necessarily their enemy. So I think that that is the rule that generally plays out, and basically I think it's Aaron got sort of caught up in some of this. One thing that Aaron did, from my perspective, that was fascinating, is I think he led an open source life. He was a very prominent blogger from the very early days of blogging, and he just decided to make everything public about what it is he did. And that was really pretty amazing. And a lot of people read his stuff, and a lot of people were inspired by his thinking. and the development of this young man. I have this photograph of us with the bookmobile in front of the Supreme Court when Larry Lessig was arguing that the copyright shouldn't be extended for yet another 20 years. We had a bookmobile. It's 2002, and there was this young little Aaron Swartz there. I don't know, it was maybe 14, 15, 16, I don't know, 14 at that time, but he was there. And he was just trying to understand what the world was and live an open life. And I'd say in some ways he was crushed by it, which is a shame. But the lesson out of this is don't always live in fear. That I think you have more friends than you know. That there's more people that will help that you know. If you're doing something where if your mission is pure, that does for a lot as you try to wiggle through and try to get some of these open practices done. So, and I just don't want to be such a downer on Aaron Swartz. I think it's an upper. He basically had an effect that was really outsized what a young man should ever have accomplished at that time, or ever could have accomplished in many other generations. And it was enabled and empowered by the technology, but also by communities that he touched, that really felt invigorated and helped by the work that he did.
Yes, and I think also it's sort of the, since Aaron's strategy of not telling any of his friends what was wrong obviously did not work, was a bad thing. I try to make the point of people to talk to people. I'm not saying tell everybody willy-nilly what's going on. I'm saying think about the people that you have in your circle that might be able to help. Maybe you know somebody at the EFF, maybe you know somebody at the Freedom of the Press Foundation, or somebody that knows somebody from one of those organizations. And it doesn't have to be the person in that organization that you'll be actually talking to. It can be somebody else that's going to find the person that you need to talk to. And, but you need to find the right person to talk to, because when it comes to this whistleblowing stuff, you really have to find another way to do it. Find a way to get the information out. Sorry. It's important when you know you have some information and it has to get out, and it doesn't seem to be getting out any other way, okay? I know that feeling, and you are probably right. And I'm not saying not to do anything. I'm saying don't just do the whistleblowing thing, even with Secure Drop right off the bat, without thinking about your other options, because it is fucked, okay? You're all by yourself. Nobody could help you if they wanted to. They really don't. They try for a while and then they forget about it because it's just too hard, okay? And sometimes, a lot of these whistleblowers, I'm not gonna name names, but sometimes it wasn't that big a deal what they released. And now they're going to prison, and for what, okay? So talk to somebody that knows what the hell's going on, figure it out, have somebody write me and I'll tell them who to talk to. I don't care, I never get personally involved in any of this stuff ever again, I'll tell you that much. But I'll definitely always help someone in trying to find the right person so that they can find the right way to get the information to the right person even. Maybe it's not the best thing to just throw it up there and see if anybody cares. Maybe there's a special person who could actually act on that information. Maybe they're gonna act on it quietly, getting things done in the background, okay? The bad guys don't even know it's out, all right? And you could get more done that way with a little more forethought. So it's not just that you don't want to throw your life away and go to prison and die. Not just that, but that you could actually maybe get more done faster if you just take a little time to think about it. So I, for one, was the Secure Drop cheerleader a couple of years ago. I'm still making my movie, but it's going to be a little different now. I'm more of a historical and a factual representation of what's going on and talking about how to deal with these issues and get things done, and not just, yay team, let's all blow the whistle and worry about it later, because later can be bad, very bad. Okay, but hey, I didn't want to end on a bad note, but we started late, so I wasn't worried about that. I did want to say one more thing about what Brewster was talking about and about what Aaron and what might have put in the crosshairs, because Jason Leopold is here to talk about the FOIA requests that Aaron was filing, many, many FOIA requests. And it's actually not the ones you think that may have been kind of triggering things, but he was doing a lot of different legal things that was drawing the government's attention. And when I started to go back and look, there was really a lot of different things, but all of them combined is going to make this guy they would just be a real pain in the ass as far as they were concerned, somebody that needed to be neutralized as soon as possible. So maybe they were waiting for their chance. And then there's just all the different hypotheses that I said before. So Jason is going to shed some light on this FOIA stuff. We're doing a lot of work at this hackathon with public records requests and automating the process. Daniel Rigmaiden is here, who exposed the stingray from prison, and it turns out that he was filing public records requests from prison, and he has a lot of extra surveillance manuals lying around when he was getting his stingray patent filings and things like that around, and we're putting a lot of this information together so that we can proactively approach cities about their surveillance equipment. And so that's why the FOIA kind of ties back into the ethical algorithms that we're about to start, the police predictive software, the Minority Report with bad software, I like to call it. And these things are all intertwined, and damn, Aaron's projects are all over the place in between them. So I actually managed to get them all here this weekend, and that's why I know it seems like a range of different topics, but they actually are very related this year, as you'll see as the day goes on. So we're going to take 5 minutes and get the next panel set up. Okay, and we're going to talk about ethical algorithms with Kristen Lum from HRDAG and Caroline Sinders from the Wikimedia Foundation and Chelsea Manning. We'll be right back.